The checkpoint outside WWII, Belgium, on the morning of December 17, 1944, was not supposed to be anything special. A small military police post on a secondary road, staffed by a handful of soldiers who had been awake too long and were running low on coffee. Vehicles came through in both directions. Most were waved past without more than a glance at identification papers. But one Jeep, carrying 3 men in American uniforms, got pulled over for a secondary check. The military police sergeant on duty could not explain afterward exactly what triggered his suspicion. The uniforms looked right. The vehicle was correct. But something about the way the men answered routine questions did not sit cleanly. Their responses came a half-second too late. Their knowledge of basic unit details was slightly off. When pressed, the answers did not match. The 3 men were detained, their documents handed up the chain, and within hours the situation became something far larger than a routine checkpoint stop. What the Americans had just caught was the forward edge of one of the most audacious deception operations the German military had ever attempted. To understand what was unfolding across the Ardennes in those first days of the German offensive, it helps to understand what the German High Command was trying to accomplish well before a single soldier crossed the border. The Ardennes offensive, launched in the early hours of December 16, 1944, was Hitler's final attempt to fracture the Allied coalition in the West. The plan was to punch through a thinly held stretch of American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, drive northwest toward the port of Antwerp, and cut off British and American forces from their supply lines. It was an enormous gamble built on the assumption that speed and surprise could compensate for Germany's shrinking resources. Embedded inside this larger offensive was a smaller, separate operation with its own objectives and its own commander. That operation was called Operation Greif, and it was placed under the command of SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny had made his name in September of 1943 when he led the raid that rescued Benito Mussolini from imprisonment in a mountain hotel in central Italy. Hitler regarded him as one of the few officers capable of executing unconventional missions that conventional military thinking would dismiss as impossible. Operation Greif followed this pattern. Skorzeny was tasked with forming a special unit, designated Panzer Brigade 150, whose soldiers would wear captured American uniforms, drive captured American vehicles, and operate behind Allied lines during the opening phase of the offensive. The mission had several components. Small teams in American uniforms would move through Allied rear areas, changing road signs, cutting communications lines, misdirecting convoys, and generally disrupting the American logistical system at a moment when confusion was already spreading rapidly. The practical challenges of building this unit were immense. Genuine American equipment was difficult to obtain in the quantities Skorzeny needed. He had requested large numbers of Sherman tanks, American trucks, and full sets of American uniforms. What he actually received fell far short of that. Only a small number of vehicles could be adequately disguised, and many of the uniforms available were incomplete or showed signs of prior use that a trained observer might notice. The soldiers selected for the mission had to speak functional English, ideally with an American accent, or at least enough fluency to pass a brief interaction. Finding men with that level of language skill inside the German military in late 1944 was not straightforward. Some recruits were drawn from German soldiers who had spent time in the United States before the war, or who had English language backgrounds. They were given American slang, taught to recognize American rank insignia, and briefed on the kind of routine knowledge a soldier would be expected to carry. Each man carried forged American identification papers, dog tags, and paybooks. The forgeries were prepared carefully, but the scale of the operation meant that not every set of documents was perfect. For small teams moving quickly through rear areas, the documents might hold up for a brief inspection. For men who ended up in extended contact with suspicious military police units, the flaws became apparent faster. The 3 men captured at the WWII checkpoint on December 17th were part of this operation. Under questioning by American intelligence officers, they confirmed their unit and their mission. And then one of the prisoners, in what may have been a deliberate attempt to create maximum disruption even in captivity, told his interrogators something that sent shockwaves through Allied command. He claimed that a larger element of the operation had been tasked not with disrupting roads and communications, but with reaching Paris and assassinating General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander. There is no evidence this claim was true. Most historians who have examined Operation Greif in detail conclude it was likely an improvisation, told under pressure by a prisoner trying to make himself seem more valuable, or trying to create chaos, even from a detention cell. But the claim landed in an Allied command structure that was already under severe stress. The German offensive had achieved genuine surprise. American units were falling back in some sectors. Reliable information was scarce. In that environment, a specific claim about an assassination plot aimed at the Supreme Commander was not something anyone could afford to dismiss. Eisenhower's security detail moved quickly. The general was effectively confined to his headquarters compound at Versailles. His movements were restricted, his schedule altered, and a double was reportedly used in certain public situations. Eisenhower himself later wrote that the confinement was deeply frustrating, coming at exactly the moment when he most needed freedom of movement to coordinate the Allied response to the Ardennes offensive. For several days, the man responsible for directing the largest land campaign in the Western Theater was effectively under house arrest imposed by his own security apparatus. The disruption spread further down the chain. Military police units across Belgium and northern France established checkpoints on roads that had not seen formal security in months. Every vehicle was stopped. Every soldier was questioned, regardless of rank. The questions were not limited to name, rank, and unit. Military police at various checkpoints developed informal systems for verifying identity that relied on knowledge only a genuine American would likely possess. Soldiers were asked about baseball statistics, the names of state capitals, the identity of popular entertainers, and details about American geography and culture. The assumption was that a German soldier, however well trained in language and slang, would not be able to answer these questions correctly under pressure. The system created friction throughout the Allied rear area. Supply convoys were delayed. Officers grew irritated at repeated stops. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was detained at a checkpoint and subjected to the same informal questioning. When asked to name the capital of Illinois, Bradley correctly answered Springfield. However, the military police soldier running the checkpoint incorrectly insisted the answer was Chicago. Bradley was eventually passed through. The incident illustrated how deeply the fear of infiltration had penetrated, reaching a point where the system was struggling to distinguish genuine Americans from infiltrators, using the same techniques meant to expose the latter. At the front, the effect on unit cohesion was measurable. Soldiers who had been fighting alongside each other for months began looking differently at personnel they did not personally know. Rumor moved faster than accurate information. Accounts of German soldiers in American uniforms captured here or killed there spread through units, gaining details and scale that the actual incidents did not always support. The psychological operation, whatever its practical limitations, was producing effects that went well beyond what Scorzani's small teams could have achieved physically. General George Patton's Third Army was in the middle of one of the most demanding operational pivots in the history of armored warfare during this same period. Patton had been ordered to turn his army 90 degrees and drive north into the Ardennes to relieve the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. Moving an entire army in winter conditions, along roads already stressed by weather and traffic, while simultaneously fighting, was an undertaking that required complete focus on forward momentum. Patton's response to the infiltration panic was characteristically blunt. He acknowledged the threat as real, but insisted that the appropriate answer was aggression, not paralysis. His army kept moving. When captured infiltrators reached his command, the legal process that followed was swift and direct. The laws of war, as understood in 1944, were specific on one point. A soldier captured in his own uniform while carrying weapons is a prisoner of war and entitled to the protections that status carries. A soldier captured behind enemy lines wearing the enemy's uniform is classified as a spy or unlawful combatant, and those protections do not apply. The distinction was not invented for this occasion. It was established in the conventions governing warfare that both sides had formally acknowledged. Skorzény's men had operated in American uniforms. That classification carried a defined legal consequence. Military tribunals were convened. The proceedings were brief by the standard of peacetime courts, but they followed the structure of military law. Charges were presented, evidence was reviewed, and findings were recorded. 18 of Skorzény's men were convicted. Over the following weeks, they were transported in small groups to a field outside Henri-Chapelle, in Belgium, where they were tied to wooden posts and shot by American firing squads. The executions were carried out with the formality that military procedure required. No record suggests any of the condemned men contested the legal basis of the proceedings, likely because the charge itself was not seriously in dispute. They had been captured in American uniforms behind American lines, and that fact was not deniable. Skorzeny himself survived the war and was tried at the Dachau military tribunals in 1947, specifically on charges related to Operation Greif. His defense rested substantially on the argument that the unit had been briefed not to engage in combat while wearing American uniforms, and that a similar operation by Allied forces, the British Special Air Service's use of German uniforms in some operations, meant that the tactic itself could not be considered categorically illegal. The tribunal acquitted him. The verdict was controversial, and the legal reasoning was not universally accepted, but it stood. The broader assessment of Operation Greif in military history is that it achieved far more psychologically than it ever could have physically. The actual disruption caused by the infiltrators who made it through Allied lines was limited. A handful of road signs changed, some communications temporarily cut, some confusion at isolated checkpoints. Measured against the military situation developing in the Ardennes, these were small contributions. But the fear of infiltration gripped Allied rear areas for weeks. It constrained Eisenhower's movements at a critical moment. It slowed logistics. It forced experienced officers to sit at checkpoints and answer questions about baseball. That effect cost the Allies time and energy they could not easily spare. What the operation ultimately demonstrated was that a relatively small deception effort, if timed correctly and aimed at the right anxieties, can produce consequences disproportionate to its actual size. The operatives who executed the mission faced firing squads when captured. Meanwhile, the architect of the operation walked free from a military tribunal in 1947. Although the soldiers shot at Henri-Chapelle faded into footnotes of the Battle of the Bulge, the strict legal boundaries defining their fate remained absolute. The line between soldier and spy had always carried consequences. In December of 1944, in a frozen Belgian field, those consequences were made concrete in a way that nobody involved was likely to forget.